All right, folks, we're going to get started. First of all, I sent around the list of the presentation schedule. Have not heard back from anybody. Hopefully these dates are okay with everybody. So we're going to go with them starting very soon. So please, that's in what, 2 weeks. If there is any kind of conflicts with these schedules, please let me know as soon as possible. All right, how about news? Anybody catch anything in the news? Water issues around the world? Yeah. What's that?
Tanker spill of ethanol into some river in, I forget what state it was. It was like 3 tankers full of ethanol.
Oh, I didn't hear this. Tanker spill of ethanol into the river. Okay. Yeah, I didn't hear. Sorry?
Somewhere upper northeast.
Okay. Have not heard of that. Okay. There was also a, in Brazil, there was a major dam break at a mining operation, I think. And it flooded out this whole this community. So that's sort of like the cyanide spill in Romania we talked about last week. This happened in Brazil a couple days ago. And that they're still trying to figure out how many people have been killed and so on. What else? Any other news?
That was in Wisconsin, in case you care.
Yeah, Wisconsin.
Wisconsin.
In the Mississippi River.
Oh, wow.
I was curious.
So that was a spill into the Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's going to be big. Okay. What else? Any other news? All right, let me point out 2 quick items that caught my attention. And then if anybody else has any other ones, feel free. Here's the first one. Water wars are coming. Civilization will never survive climate calamity. I mean, it's pretty strong terms here. And this is in Salon.com, so this is not exactly your typical, overblown, exaggerated type of publication, and yet they did publish this, which I think is a little surprising. Still, the article here is relatively well written, basically saying that the climate change summit that they're having coming up in Paris at the end of this year is a major milestone, or could be a major milestone either way. Either they're going to come up with some kind of mechanisms to respond to climate change, or they're not. And if they don't, or they don't come with a strong enough mechanism, the predictions seem pretty dire. The coming of climate civil wars. This is what this particular journalist is suggesting here, and also suggesting that some of the current conflicts in Syria, Darfur, and other parts of the world are already evidence of climate change impacts in sort of in a local area where, and one of the things you have to think about in terms of climate change, what is going to be the very, very first impact that you're going to see, that you're going to feel, we as people, and that's going to be water, because of either droughts or floods. And that's, when we're talking about climate change, we're really talking about climate variability and changing climates around the world. So the scientists suggest, the models suggest that the dry places around the world are going to get drier, the wet places are going to get wetter. Again, floods and droughts around the world, water is going to be the first thing we're really going to be facing or hit with in terms of an impact from climate change. So there's been a lot of pretty dire predictions like this one, but they're starting, the fact that they're starting to become a little more mainstream, I think is rather distressing. And so this one in Salon.com I thought was very interesting. Also, a couple of months ago, or last year maybe, there was one in the Washington Post So again, this stuff is becoming a little more mainstream. Building on this, here's another, and now you have to think what this article is saying. The title says it all. If companies are starting to worry about water, maybe there's something serious here, because we're starting to think about water affecting business and industry. And business and industry historically have been reticent to acknowledge things like climate change and long-term disasters and long-term environmental concerns. And now these companies are much more concerned. And if you look further down, here we go. This outfit that was researching them says that 405 out of the over 1,000 companies that they were surveying deemed to have high water vulnerability, meaning that water is a major component of their operation, either because they needed to produce whatever widgets or somehow it helps produce their final product. So whether it's an energy producing company and you need a lot of water for hydroelectric, obviously, but also for coal producing, even for solar, you need a lot of water. But also for automobile manufacturing, there's a lot of water that goes into the steel production process and the whole manufacturing process for automobiles. Obviously, agricultural companies need a ton of water for their operations. And this particular story says that more than half of these companies haven't done a comprehensive risk assessment to understand where the water risks actually exist in their process of production. Only 22 of publicly listed oil and gas companies responded to this particular survey, even though that particular sector is heavily dependent on having water to produce the energy for fracking and for regular oil production. 2/3 of those that actually reported said that they're vulnerable to substantive water risk. So just the idea that if these companies are starting to be worried, maybe the rest of us really should also be more concerned, and legislatures and politicians and policymakers. If you've heard about the World Economic Forum that happens at Davos every so often, I think it's every year, one of the things that they've been producing for the last number of years is a water report. So these are ministers of finance and economics and so on, and major corporate CEOs are getting together to talk about global economics, and they're talking about water. So, yeah.
Did it say what the parameters were that their report looked at to kind of judge if a corporation was prepared for water?
I think you'd have to dig into this was it CDP or whichever the report they were looking at. I didn't dig that far.
Because some of those were Ford and Toyota, and I mean, we kind of know what they're.
Well, those are the ones that they were highlighting as actually doing well.
Yeah.
Companies that have achieved an A rating on its analysis of water risk preparedness.
That's not what I would have guessed.
What's that?
I said I would have guessed that Ford and Toyota were that high with all their, I guess,
They-
production plants across the world.
Well, but what they've done, Ford and Toyota, I'm surprised I don't see Coca-Cola on here. They've also done a lot of work on assessing their water footprint. And if I remember correctly, it's either Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola. I think it's Coca-Cola has said that within the next, I don't know, it's 5 or 10 years, they want to be water neutral. They want to be recycling all their water, all their wastewater. They want to be helping to produce water, so they're investing in local infrastructure, and they're trying to eliminate completely their water footprint. So many of these countries have taken a very positive water impact study of their own operations. So I'm not surprised that Ford and Toyota and some of these other ones have done it. The problem is that these are very, very few companies that have actually done that kind of an assessment. And I think that that's one of the big issues here. So whether this is a global water issue or a transboundary water issue, this is clearly a global issue where companies are trying to figure out if they have enough water for their production, where they're going to get it. But it's also transboundary because many of these companies operate near a border, and they have to rely on the jurisdiction in which they operate to ensure that they have adequate water supplies. So if there's a transboundary lake or river that they're getting their water from, or transboundary aquifer, they are starting to become more aware, more cognizant of the politics around these transboundary arrangements, if there are any arrangements. And they're becoming very worried about these things. So just a couple of articles from the news. If there's anybody else has any good news stories that they've heard? Nobody's reading the news? Nobody's paying attention?
I actually have a good, well, you said good news, but I have
That's
one
fine.
where in Africa an agreement that was done a few years back, they don't say when, is positively impacting the community, the people there. They're saying that people that didn't have good water for consumption, now they are able to have that water, and this is in the
Which agreement?
northwest province of South Africa.
So is it a local agreement or is it international?
It's an international agreement, and because of that, people that didn't used to have water, now they have, because they release some water from a dam somewhere. Let me see, the Orange Senku River Basin.
So is this with Lesotho?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is an agreement between South Africa and Lesotho?
Yeah, it's mainly, and it's also a recent cooperation between Botswana and South Africa. And it says that now people are able to cultivate their own crops because now they have access to water. So not only it improved their quality of life because of the quality of the water, but now they're able to sustain themselves. So this is the effect of when states actually come together and cooperate.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the Orange River is a very threatened river, especially further downstream. I've seen numbers that suggest that the reduced precipitation in the region is going to drop by 15, 20, 25%, which has actually a bigger impact on the river because when you have reduced precipitation with also they're going to have increased temperature, so greater evaporation. So there's going to be somewhere around 30 to 50% less river flow, water flow in the rivers. So that's further downstream. The agreement, one of the agreements that they've gone into is with Lesotho, which is in the highlands, and Lesotho is completely encased by South Africa on all sides. It's sort of a little island country within a South Africa. Highland area, a lot of water resources with a smaller population, and they've entered into agreements to divert some of the water resources they have into the Orange River and to South Africa. And this is a major international transboundary water transfer, bulk water transfer, which is I think I've mentioned before, and it's one of the few that's actually taking place. It's the only one I know of that is taking place in a river. So it's a really interesting development, and they're paying for it. South Africa is paying Lesotho for it, and apparently the environmental issues have been thought about and addressed, at least in Lesotho, with taking out the water. But obviously, as you said, the impact further downstream has been pretty positive. So yeah, definitely. Any other news items?
Found a couple of things on Circle of Blue today. One is there's a U.S.-Mexico water deal, specifically to address sediment and trash in the Tijuana River Basin, and they established a binational advisory group that will recommend measures to improve the quality of water in the basin. And another major news that we heard of this week was Obama's rejection of the Keystone pipe.
Yeah, two really interesting developments. The Tijuana agreement, that's minute 320 between U.S. and Mexico. That's the last agreement between U.S. and Mexico recently entered in focusing on transboundary pollution, which has not been addressed hardly anywhere around the world. There's a few places, but really interesting development. And then the pipeline, that's huge news. From the energy side, but also from the water side, that at least from the U.S., water that won't go towards developing these resources, Canada, it seems like they're still going to develop the tar sands. They'll just ship them in a different direction.
Are they gonna try to ship it to the coast, the Pacific coast?
I think they're going to go to Pacific Coast, unless they can convince the U.S. again. Next administration, if it's Republican, who knows what will happen. Even the new Prime Minister of Canada was favorable, wanted to continue pursuing the pipeline. Even though he's a pretty liberal politician.
All about money.
Yeah. So, anything else? Any other news items? If you're ever starved for water news items, it's just, I've got a list going, and there are just tons of stuff going around the world, in all parts of the world. I'm trying to compile a bunch of them here on the Twitter feed. I've got some of this automated. You can see a lot of stuff going on in Africa, but also here in Texas, Latin America. I've got some of these from Central America and South America taking place. So just all over the world, water issues, major issue. And many news departments, news sources are starting to have water beats, meaning journalists who are dedicated just to the water topic. So this is happening all over the world. In fact, USCA News is now, which is that water news only service, they're starting a training program for journalists how to report about water issues. So that they understand the language, the concepts, the issues, the whole relationship between water and all these other things around us, whether it's food or energy, environment, and so on. So this is sort of a new growing development. Journalists who are just doing water issues and nothing else. So, all right, unless there's any other news, we'll go back to groundwater. All right, let me start off with a little bit of a new background on groundwater. We talked a little bit about it last class. We're going to do some more thinking about it because I'd like to use part of this class as a springboard for the negotiations. The negotiations, you're going to be talking about resources that have not been agreed to, or there's no agreement in terms of how to use them. That's going to be part of your work. What I want to do here is start talking about a topic for which there have been very few agreements at all, and start to think about how do you analyze something like water, and in particular groundwater, because I think it's a little more challenging than surface water. But how do you start to think about what rules and what things do you need to know about that water resources so you can enter into an agreement? I tried to spur you a little bit last week in terms of what rules you would have, real generically. So people drew out information, data sharing, equitable use, no harm. I want to see if we can push that further and to see how much details you would like to see in an agreement. So first of all, just a little bit reminder, around the world, over 260 transboundary water courses, watersheds, and we've got thousands of agreements everywhere, 3,600 treaties over the last 1,200 years, 400 alone in the last just 200 years, or almost 200 years. We also have an agreement that is pan-Europe, so that smaller dashed circle there was surrounding Europe, but that one is actually, they're about to open that up to global membership. They've just amended it a few years ago, and they're trying to get the final members to confirm and ratify this amendment. Once they do, this will be a new global instrument. So they're actually expanding that particular instrument, and that is the UNECE Watercourses Convention. It's also called the Helsinki Convention from 1992. The larger dashed circle is the other one global treaty. That's the UN Watercourses Convention from 1997. That one went into force in August of last year. Has 36 ratifications so far. They're pushing for more ratifications. But as you see, we've done a lot of work over literally more than 1,000 years on transboundary surface water resources. In contrast, we now know that there's more than double the number of transboundary aquifers and aquifer bodies as there are rivers and lakes that are transboundary. But we've only got one management agreement. That's that little circle right in the middle of Europe. That's the Genovese Aquifer Agreement between France and Switzerland. I'll talk more about that later. But it's a very technical agreement with allocations and limitations on pumping and artificial recharge. Really a fascinating and very developed, very technical agreement. So that's one. We have two extraction restriction agreements. So these are agreements that all they do is they agree to not pump. One of which is between U.S. and Mexico in the area of Sonora in Mexico and Arizona in the United States. And there's an aquifer there that they've just agreed not to pump from or to limit the pumping from that particular aquifer. The other one, if you look in the Middle East, little yellow circle, Jordan and Saudi Arabia over the DC aquifer. And again, what they're doing there is they decided to restrict pumping in a certain portion of the aquifer. There's nothing else really in these agreements other than restrictions on pumping. So what else do we have? Two data sharing agreements in North Africa, the Western Sahara and the Nubian sandstone aquifers. The countries that overlie these two aquifers, all they've done is agreed to share data and exchange data. Nothing more, nothing on allocation or anything else. One framework management agreement not yet enforced. That's in South America, the Guarani Aquifer. It's a loose framework agreement. Doesn't have a lot of details, but it's not ratified. The countries have signed it, but they haven't ratified it, which is under international law. You need the ratifications to make it official. In fact, the legislature, I believe it was in Paraguay, voted against it after their own president signed it. But that was because they were upset at one of their neighbors, and it's sort of regional politics. And right now, it's this agreement is sitting on the shelf, hasn't made much progress in terms of getting ratifications and being put into force. And lastly, the little blue dots are three memoranda of agreements or memoranda of understanding. These are unofficial agreements, not enforceable under law, but sort of handshake agreements across the border. You have between Washington State and British Columbia over the Abbotsford Streamless Aquifer, between the water utilities, so it's not even a state level, but it's water utilities of El Paso and water utilities of Ciudad Juarez. They have a handshake agreement. They've actually written it out, so you have something to look at, but it's not enforceable. But they have an agreement there. And then in Western Africa, you have the Ulamaden Aquifer. The countries overlying that aquifer have an MOA, Memorandum of Agreement, and they're talking about trying to make it a more concrete treaty, but it hasn't happened yet. So in contrast to those 3,600 treaties, this is all we got for transboundary groundwater. Now, why am I highlighting this? Why is this important? Because international law, when you develop international law, you're looking for state practice because you're looking to see what states are doing to try to extrapolate, well, what's the law? How are they acting in relation to each other? Are they cooperating? What are they cooperating over? What are their interests? What are their needs? Are they developing trust between them? This is the basis for what we call customary international law. When we have 3,600 agreements for surface water, we've got a lot of examples. When we've got, 9? Not even, because 3 are MOAs. so they're unenforceable. So 6 agreements for groundwater, and we have 600 or more transboundary aquifers. It's really hard to extrapolate international law. Maybe you can identify some trends, and I'll talk about those later. But
But wouldn't that be better?
wouldn't that be better than what? Than nothing.
Well, if you have a limited amount of treaties out there for groundwater, between those 5 or 6,
Yeah.
whenever they have a dispute, they need to go to what they have seen as customary so far. And they can actually, if they do it right,
Yeah.
they can do a good foundation
Mhm.
for others in the future. And
Sure.
I think the less the treaties, the better if you generalize them. I mean,
Except the problem is, think about the hypothetical I gave you guys, and you have interests that don't really fit together, and usually that's what happens around the world. Countries want to use more water than is actually physically in the river or in the aquifer, and so they're going to try to find the customary law that best serves their needs, which is what we do here in the U.S. We just, the lawyers look for the law that, or the case that best supports their argument. But when you have very little experience and very few examples, you start struggling to, what is the law for this particular aquifer or that particular scenario? And it's very hard when if you have 3,600 examples, maybe you have a lot of good examples to point to. You have 6 here, 3 that are unofficial, very little to point to. Yes, maybe they can craft great cooperative agreement, but that's if both countries are in great terms and they're willing to sit down and negotiate. So it's a challenge. One of the things that we talked about, we pointed out, to develop a treaty, to develop an agreement, to develop law, even legal norms, we need to have information. A lot easier to develop for surface water than it is for groundwater. So these are the things that you have to keep in mind. If you're going to try to negotiate an agreement with your neighbor, what information do you need? Maybe you also need to negotiate development of the information before you can actually reach some kind of numerical outcome, a physical allocation or quantifiable allocation. Maybe you don't want a quantifiable allocation if you don't know the details. Maybe you want percentages. Or maybe you want something more generic like equitable and reasonable, and leave it for a later dispute to figure out what equitable and reasonable might be. This is some of the thinking that you have to go into at the international level because of all the things we've talked about for the last couple months. Sovereignty, this is hard. Countries are unwilling to give up their sovereignty and their right to make decisions about resources inside of their country. They're even challenged often to release this kind of information. So many times they won't even agree to give you this information, to exchange the information that you need to form the basis of an agreement. Well, can you convince them? Is it in their best interests? This is where negotiation and diplomacy comes in. A little bit more history on the development of international law for transboundary aquifers. As I said, there's very little history. What we've seen is references to groundwater started appearing about 200, maybe a little less than 200 years ago, but really as secondary or tertiary issues. Sometimes they would reference a spring as a source of water, and springs emanate from groundwater, from aquifers, but it was in very loose terms, and always the treaty was not about the spring. It was always about something else. Border demarcation, maybe a transboundary river, some kind of military agreement, and as a secondary or tertiary issue, you have a water arrangement coming from a spring. Then in the early 1900s, mid-1900s, you started seeing a recognition that groundwater and surface water are somehow connected. Again, it was a secondary sort of recognition. They weren't focusing on the aquifers themselves. They were focusing on the rivers and saying, oh, by the way, yeah, we do recognize that this river is dependent on that aquifer or vice versa, but the agreement is really over the river. And you see a bunch of treaties, especially in Europe in the early to mid 1900s, that reference these kinds of, that they have these, they acknowledge these kinds of connections. Even in the more modern agreements, 92 UNEC Water Convention, that's the one that, as I said, was going to be, looks like it's going to be expanded from just Europe to the rest of the world. You have the UN International Law Commission resolution on transboundary groundwater, confined aquifers, and then the UN Watercourse Convention from 97. These are focused on surface water, and groundwater is a secondary issue. You really don't see a focus on groundwater hardly at all until 1973 might be the first time. And this was this amendment to the 1944 U.S.-Mexico agreement over the Rio Grande and Colorado. So the main agreement was over the Rio Grande and Colorado, but then they had an amendment. But I'm not even sure that that's correct for me to put this in here, because the amendment focused on the salinity levels in the Colorado River and then had separate provisions that were directly focused on groundwater, had nothing to do with the Colorado. They just stuck it into that agreement, completely irrelevant topics, but it is direct. So I put it here. And this is the agreement that restricts groundwater in Sonora and Arizona, I mentioned before. All these agreements are the one I just mentioned a few minutes ago with the little circles of groundwater. I just put these here in chronological order. You can see that agreements that focus directly on groundwater really started in the 70s. And we have agreements over rivers and lakes going back over 1,000 years. So to try to extrapolate rules of management, of allocation under international law, really, really challenging, because we don't have a lot of experience in this. So let me turn now to another development that occurred in 2002. UN International Law Commission, UNILC. This is an organization, they're sort of like the lawyers for the UN, but the people who sit on this commission are legal experts from representing different countries. You have to be elected. So it's not an appointed position. You get elected by the General Assembly, but you represent your country, in a sense, on this commission. They were tasked with trying to codify international law for shared groundwater resources. This started in 2002, and I want to highlight something. From 2002 to 2008, 6 years they worked on this. I had the honor of serving on an advisory committee for their efforts. What's really interesting, the UN Watercourses Convention, they did the same. They also drafted that one, the one that eventually became the convention. That one took them 25 years. This one took them 6 years. Might have been a little too quick. And I'll explain why in a minute. But partly, they took their draft articles to the UN General Assembly and they said, here's our work product. We came up with 19 ideas for rules. Here they are. Think about it, General Assembly. It's up to you now to decide if to put this into a treaty or what to do with it. That was 2008, and it was specifically said that they would think about it for 3 years and bring it up again in 2011. They brought it up in 2011 and said, yes, we thought about it, and we think we should table it again until 2013. 2013 came on. A little bit of a different. Rather than saying we're just going to think about it, they actually said we commend them as guidelines to the states. So they actually took a half step further. And they said to the rest of the world, don't just look at these, but look at these more seriously. Maybe even think about these as guidelines for your own negotiations. That was 2013. Then they tabled them again. October 2016. That's the next time they're supposed to come up on the UN General Assembly agenda. We'll have to wait and see what they do with this. So where are we now? We talked a lot about international law for surface water. Best I can say, the word at the top right there is trends. I don't know if we really have international law for transboundary aquifers, but all those many, 6 agreements, this is what I've been able to extrapolate. Some of them really emphasize sovereignty over natural resources in a way they didn't do for surface water. But for groundwater, it seems like it's in there a little stronger, which is counterintuitive if this is a resource that flows across a border. So a little bit awkward. Most of these agreements, 6 agreements and 3 unofficial memoranda of agreement, they seem to like no significant harm and equitable and reasonable utilization. We've talked about what those rules mean in the context of surface water. They just tweak them to be more applicable to groundwater in terms of the factors and issues. General obligation to cooperate. Those are all substantive rules. And then procedural rules. Prior notification, we've talked about that. Exchange of information, monitoring. But really very little to go on when you're looking at 6 agreements and trying to develop international norms. So this is why I've suggested these are just trends. So looking at this, let's say these are the basic rules. Where are the gaps? What's not in here? For those of you with maybe some hydrogeology background, think about how an aquifer operates. Some of the comments were made last week, I think, are very relevant, if you can think back to those. All right, I'm going to take the slide off the screen so maybe we can talk some back and forth. What do you guys think? What's missing from these really generic equitable and reasonable data sharing kind of rules?
The hydrologic information seems to be missing from the groundwater rules. The provision
When you
for
say
examination. Yeah.
What do you mean by the hydrologic information is missing? What do you mean by that?
Aquifers have absolute signatures from the standpoint of transmissivity, boundaries that pertain to how the pressure gradients are managed inside of them, issues that pertain to what can happen due to over-pumping or subsidence.
Well, is that information that should be shared, and we have a general rule for data sharing, or is that, or do you want a norm, a rule inside an agreement or inside international law that's more specific?
I think it would need to be applied to a rule that says that you must address the hydrologic signature of an aquifer.
What does it mean to address? I'm trying to think. You got to think from a legal point of view, not from a scientific point of view. What does it mean to address the hydrological signature of an aquifer? Because we're trying to create. I'm sorry?
Statements pertaining to hydrostatic pressure.
But what are you asking the country to do? Are you asking them to generate data? Are you asking them to maintain certain characteristics of an aquifer so that they don't change?
Yeah, I think that maintaining the characteristics that are indicative of flow.
Okay.
Would there be any way, I guess we're starting out to look at flow regimes as far as like connectivity?
Okay.
Surface water and groundwater?
Well, this again, is that a issue of developing data, or is that an issue of creating an obligation to maintain those kind of flow regimes.
I
Because the-
would, yeah. I would state that it's to maintain the characteristics of the aquifer.
Okay, yeah,
I think somewhere along the line, you want to have the parties recognize that those things exist and that they're important, right? That they're impactful to the.
well, let me ask you this. Let me ask you this. If two countries that share a transboundary aquifer, that aquifer is not shared with any other nation, if those countries decide we're going to pump this sucker dry, what do you think? Can they do it?
So
What's
they ought
that?
to be held, they ought to be held accountable for the consequence of doing it.
But wait, who's going to suffer the consequences?
Other downstream.
What's that?
Other downstream countries.
Well, no, I'm talking about an aquifer that is solely shared by two countries. Nobody else shares that aquifer.
Future generations.
Future generations, but whose future generations?
Their own.
Theirs.
Well,
Under sovereignty,
and
they would
some-
have that.
So think about sovereignty. What were you going to say?
Well, I was thinking some of the neighboring ones that are going to feel obligated to help in the future.
Well, they don't have to help. No? Because I'm asking this pointedly because what is the obligation of a nation to, in relation to a transboundary water resource? Your obligation is typically to the other sharing nation, right? Whereas I think sometimes we feel an obligation to the resource itself. We've got to protect that aquifer. We've got to protect the river. Well, that becomes an altruistic obligation, not a legal obligation, right? We don't have laws that says we protect environment for the sake of the environment. The Endangered Species Act is the closest thing that we have that says we should protect those critters because we decided that they're important. But technically, you're protecting those critters because they're important to people, and you're going to harm that importance to people if you harm the critters. Same thing with Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Drinking Water Act, anything that any environmental provision, law that we've ever developed. We're protecting the interest of people, not the interest of the environment.
But if they use the equitable use provision
Okay?
the right way and sustainable development of the aquifer, if they actually follow those the way that they are supposed to, doesn't that prevent that from happening?
Well, what do you mean the way they are supposed to? If they decide, we're going to pump the sucker dry, or we're going to extract knowingly in excess of recharge because we have current needs, we have to provide water for our dying population right now, and we know we're going to harm our future generations, but we won't have future generations if we don't provide water for our current population. If they decide to deplete the aquifer, would they violate any kind of international law or any kind of obligation anywhere?
Well, I guess in the future, if they did do that, and then all of a sudden neither of those two countries can have enough water to farm or feed their countries, is there any way that the countries who would be giving aid, I guess retrospectively after the fact, can say, well, you had water and you use it all, so but I guess we're not going to do that.
Well, I mean,
So I don't know if there is some sort of
is there a law?
UN convention that-
Well, is there a law that you must be your brother's keeper?
But there's a right to life.
But who is the right to life held against, and by whom? Right to life rights are held by citizens against their own government. So, yes, there may be a right to life, but it's been a real challenge to say that U.S. owes Mexicans a right to life in terms of water in Mexico, right? That international law hasn't quite, at least in my opinion, hasn't gotten to that level yet. Right to life, yes, so it's citizens against their own government. But does that mean anybody else can come in and enforce it?
So So what happens if, that same scenario, if there was two states, could the United States government come in and enforce it?
What do you mean, the two
Like
states?
if two states decided that just one aquifer was underlying, just only two states, and they decided we're not gonna regulate any of this.
Okay, I'll give you an example. U.S. and Mexico decide that the Hueco Bolson aquifer, which is underneath El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, we just need to provide for current users right now. We're hoping technology provides us more water in the future, but we don't know, but we need water right now. Is Argentina going to come in? Is Russia going to come? I mean, what do you think? Europe, all the European countries.
No.
No. Do they have a right to come in? No. So does the United States have a right to go into Jordan and Saudi Arabia over the DC aquifer? If they decide to pump it dry, or the Guarani aquifer in South America, or any sovereignty. This is part of the problem, is that sovereignty limits what countries can do internally within a country. A country from outside coming in, what can they do? The only place where we have seen countries coming from the outside and doing something inside is in humanitarian crises. So, Darfur, Syria, place where the genocide situations. Think about the only cases internationally where somebody has been prosecuted for a domestic crime. It's the war crimes tribunals. That's the only time. Never has there been anything for environmental harm. That for domestic. Now, there's been cases that have brought for transboundary environmental harm, U.S., Canada, the trail smelter, but that was just between U.S. and Canada. No European country came and ruled over it and decided it, right?
Now, there was one of the documents that said not to do harm to other states or the environment. Are they trying to broaden that so they can maybe...
Which document? Do you remember which document that was?
I can maybe...
Yeah, if you can remember, because there are many folks who are trying to broaden the impact or the effect of some of these rules and how they might apply. So but it hasn't quite gotten to that level because countries are unwilling to give up that kind of sovereignty and to allow countries outside. We don't want Russia meddling in our environmental business or our water business, right?
I think it was the Guarani, but let me check.
Well, the Guarani agreement.
Let me see.
I wouldn't think so. So back to two countries, if they decide to have an agreement over an aquifer, what can and can't they do? We mentioned
It's the Guarani.
that. What does it say?
Well, it says the parties exercise in their respective territories the sovereign right to promote the management, monitoring, blah, blah, of the aquifer and shall use such resources on the basis of reasonable and sustainable uses, respecting the obligation of not causing significant harm to the other parties or the environment.
Okay. So not causing significant harm to the other parties or the environment. So first of all, is it any different from significant harm we've talked before?
I think the application, they're trying to broaden it.
To environment?
Yes. When they
Okay.
put the environment, then I don't know who can claim that right to
That's
say
the
you're
question.
doing
Good.
this wrong, but apparently they're trying
Yeah.
to make it where...
Well, that's going to be the question. From a legal point of view, it's called standing. Who would have the right to bring a claim of a violation of harm to the environment? First of all, this is an agreement only between the 4 countries over the Guarani. So only the 4 countries they're the only ones who are going to sign this agreement, or have signed this agreement. So they're the only ones who would have standing because they are parties to that agreement, nobody else. Second of all, as I said earlier, they've signed, but no one's ratified the agreement. So yes, it might seem like they're trying to expand it to the environmental harm, but again, it's only for the 4 countries, and none of them have ratified it. So you see
It
little.
helps a little bit because, for
a little bit,
example,
yeah.
when we did the Mekong River Basin, the case study,
Yeah.
which one was the country in the very bottom?
Vietnam or
Vietnam. Let's say if Cambodia does something that it only affects Vietnam,
mhm.
at least Laos or some other country further upstream could say, no, you're not going to do that.
Mhm.
Under this where it says or environment,
Okay.
where if you don't have the or environment, then only Vietnam would have been able
Well,
to
let
do
me
something against that
let me ask you
country.
this: could on the Mekong, could Vietnam do something that will negatively affect its environment? Not affect Laos or Cambodia or anybody else, just its environment. Let me make it simpler. Could the United States decide to burn down Yosemite National Park?
Probably
We
not.
couldn't? The United States?
I mean, yeah, we could.
What would stop us?
I mean, another country coming in.
What? But
Yeah.
what interest would another country have?
Oh, another country.
Yeah, what interest would another country have? What international law would address our domestic environment?
Probably some of the animals that I would guess, just like what you said earlier about the endangered species. If there's
But
any in there.
But that's U.S. law. That's the Endangered Species Act. That's U.S. law. It's not international law. So, it's
International Migratory Bird Law.
Wait.
Right.
Treaty.
that's the treaty we have with I think Mexico and the U.S. and
But
Canada. Yes.
If it
Yes.
had affected that, they might not see it.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe the migratory bird. What is it? Migratory Birds Treaty Act.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe.
I think there's a trend to try to.
There is a trend. Look, and the environmental movement didn't exist until the 1960s and 1970s. So that's when the first environmental protection agencies came about, was in 1970s. I think the EPA, the US EPA, was the first one. I'm not sure, but they didn't exist before. So there is an environmental movement that has been going on for the last 40, 50 years. And it has gotten to the level of international law. But it keeps hitting on sovereignty. And for good or for bad. I mean, do we want Russia in our environmental business?
So how does it work with like the UN? So if we did go or decide that we wanted to burn down Yosemite and Russia decided they want to do something, kind of like when we decided that we wanted to go into Iraq, you have to go through like a UN convention and have people sign off on it, or does the country just say that's what we're doing?
Well, it depends what kind of harm you're having. The only time we've ever, internationally, done something that because of a domestic event is in humanitarian law, war crimes. So internal genocide or internal war crimes, crimes against humanity, there's very few examples, in terms of what those things are.
Is a crime against the environment a crime against the humanity?
It is not gotten to that level, at least not been recognized to that level.
Now, a couple of days
Climate
ago,
change.
they reassigned water rights to a country with the Syrian refugees so they can have more water rights to supply, to.
What do you mean they
have a-
reassign water rights?
I read, I need to find it, but
Okay.
I read in one of the news articles this week
Okay.
that Syrian refugees, they're in this country and they reassign water rights so that country where they're in can have, I don't know if it's temporary. I'm
Well,
guessing it's temporary.
It's probably temporary.
Uh-huh.
It could
So
only
they
be
can
Jordan
meet
or
the
Turkey.
needs of those refugees.
Yeah,
So I thought that also that was,
Sure.
then it could also broaden what you just said about.
But that's one
Keeps
example.
going.
If
Yeah,
we have
but-
3 or 4 or 5 examples,
Well-
now maybe we have a trend. No, but this is exactly what you have to look for in terms of trying to identify what is international law. You're looking for these kinds of examples that are repeated, and they're similar enough that you can say, there's a trend in this direction. And maybe after a dozen or 20 or 30 examples, now you can say, you know what, states are doing it in a particular way, so maybe we can say it's customary international law. If they actually codify it, now you have a treaty. So that's what you want, these kinds of examples. You want these treaties, yeah.
So in your scenario with the 2 states and the aquifers just occupying the 2 states, and they're gonna, drain it dry. I keep I wonder if, regional national security would give one standing. If they were to do this, well, at some point they're gonna need water from somewhere else, and that's gonna affect the security issues in that.
Yeah. Well, you have to have a determination that it will affect the security. Who makes that determination?
Well, the country that feels that it's gonna affect them.
Well, but now it becomes you say it does, and I say it doesn't. So you have to, it's very hard at that level because we don't have a international mandatory judicial system to decide these things. These are decided on diplomatics, right? They're decided by diplomacy, not by some required, an overseer who makes decisions. We do have international courts, but states have to volunteer to go to those courts. So it's not obligatory. So whether it is an international security issue or not, I say it isn't, you say it is. What is it?
Yeah, there's a difference in talking about scanning, which is a legal issue, versus who has an interest.
Right.
What I'm referring to is more of who has an interest.
Okay.
If I'm a state neighboring one of these 2 states or close by, and I'm sitting on water that, they may come and try and get once they're done using all theirs.
Right.
I think I may be adversely impacted by their behavior now.
But even there, when you're talking about having an interest, what is what's the word? A viable interest or relevant interest? Because I may think that what your claim is an interest is irrelevant. So we don't have it, even when we go to court based on standing, and you have to show that you have an interest, that you're an interested party, the court's going to assess the degree to which you have an interest, right? So, for example, in the cases dealing with the endangered species, how do you establish your interest? Well, you've got to show that you enjoy looking at and watching those particular endangered species. You've gone to that location where their habitat and so on. Because if you're on the other side of the country and you're just saying, yeah, I'm really interested in those endangered species in Washington State, I've never traveled there, but I'm interested. Well, what kind of an interest is that? Is that a strong enough legal interest? And that's the same problem we have here. The difference is, in our legal system, we do have a judicial mechanism that decides, yes, it's good enough, no, it's not. A judge decides. Internationally, we don't.
Yeah, internationally, you don't have that structure in that, therein is the source of many of the issues that we're discussing. But, I think I kind of maybe go back to what I had said originally is, at some point, the parties need to determine what is and is not important to the parties
Right.
negotiating.
Okay.
One state says, this is important to me, and the other state says,
Good.
you don't care, right? We're sitting on an aquifer that we both share, and no one else. One state's gonna pump all they can, and the other state wants to conserve.
Well, that's a different scenario that I gave the one before.
Sure, it is, but that's I think that's an example of where you have a difference in interest. If both states are going to pump as much as they can, their interests seem to be similar. They may not be aligned, but they're similar, and they want to.
And if both states
for themselves.
Yep. If both states agree to pump, the question I asked was, can a third state come in and do anything about it? That's where I thought you were heading with your interest. Well, the neighboring states, they know that 20 years from now they're going to be trying to, prevent all these water refugees because they don't have enough water. They pump their aquifer dry. they're going to be coming to our country, so that's my interest. Well, is that a strong enough interest? Is that a legal interest? And that's where it's problematic in international law. So,
Yeah, you don't have that,
Mhm.
overriding single authority
yeah,
to help, clarify the issues. I think if I am making an analogy in my head in Texas where you have, I can't remember the name of the water district. One's gonna, allow water marketing in the
Oh.
district right next, I forget, what is it?
Yeah.
Savannah something?
I don't remember.
Okay, you know what I'm talking
Yeah.
about. You got one district that wants to conserve, the other district's gonna allow water marketing, okay? But in this case, you do have an overriding body in Texas.
Yeah.
So if it actually comes down to it, there can be some,
Sure.
you know.
Some resolution.
Yeah. But on the international level, you don't. So it's a much trickier game there.
Exactly. So now, what do you want to see in your agreement that you think might hold up under international law? What don't you want to see in your agreement? So I gave you some generic trends that I've been able to identify from these 6 or 9 agreements, but there's a whole lot that's missing. One suggestion was having to do with maintaining the flow or the flow direction or flow volume. That's been one suggestion. And my question was, who's going to enforce that? Well, it's got to be only the parties who agree to it. And I wanted just to sort of identify that point. So back to the gaps in international law. What other gaps are there for transboundary aquifers?
Well, so far they're not addressing the connectedness of groundwater.
Can't hear you.
Right now they're not addressing the connectedness between groundwater and surface water. So you lack that base flow, the connection of groundwater to base flow in the rivers.
Okay, the connection between surface water and groundwater resources, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. So what would you want to see in the agreement
Well, I guess
or
it's,
in international law?
I guess it's similar to what was said from Galveston, which is just having something in the law that looks at recharge, that looks at all of the geologic properties of that aquifer to maintain, because they're going to be interested in their surface water to maintain the surface water flows or whatever's sufficient. And on top of that, I don't think that there should be a definite quantifiable allocation. It should probably be a percentage because the volume of the aquifer, especially if it's a fossil aquifer, is going to change over time significantly.
Okay. So maintaining the existing surface water, groundwater relationship, right? What about climate change? If we know that we have climate change and we're going to have less precipitation in a particular region, and we're putting something in the agreement, or we're saying there should be an international law that protects the currently existing flow regime within the aquifer or flow regime between an aquifer and surface water. How do we control that if climate change is going to affect it negatively? Does that mean we have to pump less?
Could you put something in the language that says that you as a country have to come up with some sort of alternative, like desalination or wastewater reuse or some other form of technology to conserve?
I mean, what's that?
The affirmative act is what she's saying.
Well, that she was suggesting that you put in provision requiring you to find alternative water resources, desalination, recycling. What do you think?
What about the law of the seas? I know it's about the seas, but
Mhm.
and it may not apply to the groundwater necessarily, but everything on a river will eventually
Okay,
end up in international waters.
okay.
Could that be used in a way?
Well, only if you tell me what specifically in the Law of the Seas, because Law of the Seas has 300 or 400 different provisions.
I don't know, maybe about no harming or no polluting or something. I don't know.
Well,
I haven't read the.
Okay, but no harm we've talked about, so we do have that in at least conceptually trends. No polluting. What about that? Do we want that for an aquifer, transboundary aquifer? Let me ask something you said about recharge. What do you want to do about recharge?
Well, I think one of the most important parts is trying to establish a body to find where the recharge locations are and how much recharge there actually is, because you can't really make any legal language without knowing what's there in the first place. And I know that that's
Okay.
something that in the scientific community they're still struggling with.
Well, so one thing is data generation. So we know data generation is important. But you said two other things that I want to bring out. The second thing you said was creating a body. Now, you focused on creating a body for data generation. What about that? An organization that is responsible to try to develop new data and new information, so that we're not just leaving it to each individual country to provide this information, or that we rely on each other to provide this information.
You're talking about having like what is the equivalent of a river commission authority?
What about a transboundary aquifer commission, which has some kind of shared governance, develop jointly, develop data jointly, as opposed to individually, independently? You're going to give up a lot of sovereignty to create this. So, that you have to be careful.
But you have a lot of benefits.
Well, it's possible, but the question is, do the benefits outweigh the sovereignty, the amount of sovereignty that you're giving up? So that's one. Now, there was something else that you said in terms of, so developing the data, some kind of entity, but back to recharge, protecting recharge, something along those lines. Does anybody want to try to think about what's something in there?
Monitoring?
More than monitoring. Where does recharge happen?
On the surface?
Okay, somewhere on the surface. Good.
Usually not within the boundaries
Not-
where the aquifer sits. Not necessarily where the aquifer sits.
Right. It's not where the storage of the aquifer sometimes is, sometimes isn't. So we know recharge starts on the surface because we know it. We're talking about recharge usually from rain, sometimes from surface water bodies. What does that suggest to you that you might want to do?
I'd like to add
protect.
something to that.
Yeah.
In hydrology and hydrogeology, you learn that sometimes you have streams that are losing or gaining. So you could actually have a country that, what did you say? That they're taking a lot of water from the river that could actually be recharging the aquifer for someone downstream as well. So you have that, again, that surface and groundwater interaction issue.
Okay, good. So that's a little bit of a different concept where I was going, so I'll come back to that later. But the idea of the surface water, groundwater interaction, which you were talking about earlier, and the idea, at least if you have an agreement, how do you regulate that kind of interaction, knowing that if you extract from one, it's going to affect the volume of the other, the flow of the other? Do you want to protect natural flow? That means nobody gets any water. Do you want to restrict it in some way? Remember, people need water for drinking, they need water for electricity, they need water for agriculture. So we need some of this water. The question is, how much are we allowed, or are we willing to reduce in the river and in the aquifer? So somebody else had a hand up? Patrick?
I thought, were you, as far as the surface of the recharge, were you implying that you're going to need to, regulate or monitor the behavior on the surface?
A little more. What do you mean by that?
Well, if your recharge area is going to affect your aquifer, then you need to monitor your surface and where it's recharging.
Okay, what are you going to monitor in the recharge zone?
Human activity.
Human activity, pollution, construction.
Austin, right?
Exactly. So maybe you want to have some kind of provisions in there that relate to protection of the recharge zone. Now, if this is an open area, the water infiltrating into the ground, do you want to allow construction there? Do you want to allow the city dump? Do you want to allow infrastructure or industry? Do you want to allow what do you want to allow? How about agriculture in a recharge zone? I mean, this is very, very serious. This is why Austin has all these no construction areas, because they're in recharge zones. So maybe in this agreement you want to protect the recharge zone. How about the other side? Discharge zones. What's a discharge zone for an aquifer? Springs. Yeah. And, think about it. You might want to protect that spring, because what's that spring feeding? Eventually it's forming a river, right? So again, you have your surface water, groundwater interaction.
If you have if there is a connectivity between the surface and the groundwater, a hydrological connectivity, if you have a strong agreement for the surface waters, it has positive results on the groundwater.
Not always, because when you have an agreement over surface water, you're completely focusing on the surface water, what you think is the viable river.
No, I'm not saying that you disregard the groundwater. All I'm
Right.
saying is that
Well, we do disregard
one thing you need to do is really strengthen that surface water agreement, besides also, together with also developing certain standards for the groundwater.
Right, but what I'm saying is we don't do that. All of our treaties are very one-dimensional. Surface water. Sometimes as a secondary issue they address groundwater. But there has not been a treaty that addresses both surface and groundwater together equally. I've never seen a treaty like that. So when we strengthen surface water agreements, that's great. But we're not thinking about the implications on groundwater. So we may strengthen the agreement to protect the surface water, but completely ignoring that either the aquifer feeds the river or the river feeds the aquifer. You have pollution going one way or another, and so on. So I think you have to take it one step further than just strengthening the river agreements. Let me go back to a couple comments that were made in terms of water flow within the aquifer. What else would you want to protect within the aquifer? What else would you want to protect within the aquifer that is a little bit different than in terms of protecting a river? What happens when you deplete an aquifer? What?
Surface.
A little louder.
Yeah, thinking of the surface.
You have sinking of the surface, which means what?
You lose storage ability.
Okay, sinkholes, but what happens to the aquifer itself?
You lose that storage ability in the aquifer.
It gets compacted, which means all the pores, all the little spaces in the aquifer that's where you were storing all that groundwater, they get squished, and they can no longer store water, groundwater. So there's a concept that has been developing that actually I have to say a buddy of mine, when we were advising the UN International Law Commission, we promoted and they seem to like aquifer functioning. An aquifer functions in a certain way, and it allows water flow in a certain way, at a certain speed, in a certain direction, at a certain rate. That's how the aquifer functions. Rivers do the same thing, but the impact on a river, if you dam a river, either the river is going to go around you, or it's going to go over you. If you change the functioning of an aquifer, the water is going to have to go somewhere else, but that thing you called an aquifer has been destroyed. The river will just find it's a new path and a new riverway. Not quite the same thing underground, because formations have to be porous and have to be permeable to have an aquifer. And if they can't find it underground somewhere else, the water is going to come to the surface. The water is going to not be stored in a aquifer type formation. It's going to have to go elsewhere, and we lose the thing we called an aquifer. So protecting functioning of an aquifer is another idea. You mentioned pollution of aquifers. That's not in the trends. It's in the trends in surface water. You really don't see very much of it in surface water. You've never seen it, with one exception now, you've never seen it in groundwater agreements. Well, there's only, like I said, 6, except the Jordanian-Saudi Arabian agreement actually has a provision that says that that the parties will absolutely prevent pollution. The way it's written, almost suggests absolute no pollution. Not even accidental, but yeah, it depends how you read that agreement. But one treaty, one provision does not make it for a trend, so I can't say that that's a trend of any type.
Why should we differentiate between accidental or intentional?
Why should we differentiate between accidental and intentional? Well, in terms of what?
For pollution, in this case, for...
Right, but we're talking about an agreement that results in liability. Would you still have the same degree of liability if you intentionally polluted a transboundary river versus accidentally?
Okay.
You see?
Mm-hmm.
So if it was accidental, you might still be responsible for cleaning it up, but the measure of damages, harm, punitive. Yeah, exactly. Now, international law, we don't have punitive, but still, there's a measure of harm that you do take into account. Let me throw out a couple of other ideas that at least I've thought of and brought up in terms of gaps in the meager amount of trends that we can identify out there. So, functioning of a transboundary aquifer, we mentioned. Protecting recharge and discharge zone, we mentioned. Aquifer pollution prevention. How about aquifer-dependent ecosystems? Think about it. Think about the Edwards Aquifer. This is, I think, the perfect example. And there are a few of these around the world, but there are critters living inside of the aquifer because this is a karst aquifer. It actually has caverns and holes and caves and inside. And there's blind fish and albino salamanders. Well, I think they're living in the springs that come out of this aquifer, but they live nowhere else in the world. And there are some snails and some insects that live there, some crustaceans, nowhere else in the world, only this particular aquifer. There are other karst aquifers around the world. In the Balkans, that's a very karstic area, right on the northeastern Mediterranean. And there's other places around the world where you have a lot of these karst aquifers and very unique creatures inside the aquifer and in springs that come out of the aquifers. And so if you affect the water volume in the aquifer, you're going to affect the habitats inside and outside of these aquifers. And very fragile, very unique ecosystems. All right, this is one of my pet interests, metadata and methodologies. One of the biggest problems we've seen is that how we measure groundwater flow, for example, or groundwater chemical composition. There's a good 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different methods, techniques, even equipment that you can use. And if one country decides to use methodology A and the other country decides to use methodology B, the results are not always equivalent. And very often they're in different units. And you exchange your information, and the information doesn't compare. It's not you can't use it. You have to try to convert it, but they're using different methodologies, which means that they have different variables that go into the computations, and different factors and different things that are important that go into the computations. So one of the things that is important for surface water too, but especially for groundwater, is that the two countries disagree on what techniques they're going to use to measure things that are as simple as aquifer flow or volume or chemical composition or flow direction or any of these things. And they need to harmonize all this information about how they're going to generate and the real information, the real data. So this is what we call metadata and methodologies. Somebody mentioned fossil aquifers, non-recharging aquifers. Should those be subject to the same rules as recharging aquifers? If you think about it, the moment you start extracting, you're going to deplete it. And it's, some of these aquifers, they still recharge, but it's 10 or 20 or 50,000 years. That's how long it takes to take water through the little bit of rain that actually reaches there and replenish it. For our purposes, because of our relatively shorter lifespans as compared to aquifers, we call these non-recharging, and we can just, pump them dry, at least within our lifespans, or 2 lifespans, 3 lifespans, 4 lifespans. Should they have different rules? Nobody's actually, a lot of people say yes, a lot of people say no, but nobody seems to have come up with any kind of definitive. We mentioned joint institutional mechanisms. There seems to be no thoughts about that, or at least no trends. Cross-border public participation. This is one where you don't see a lot also for surface water. You're starting to see it. But I found the MOU between Washington State and British Columbia over the Abbotsford Sumas Aquifer actually allows people on the other side of the border to come in and argue for or against groundwater permits. Now, it's not decisive, but they do have a right to voice their pros or cons, whether that local water body should or should not issue a groundwater permit, extraction permit. So I thought this was pretty interesting. And then the last one, sovereignty. I mean, is this coal? Is this oil? Or is this something different? When we say that we have sovereignty over a transboundary oil reserve, we really are saying if 75% of that oil is under my country, I get 75%. That's natural resource law, and that's very well accepted. Do we apply the same notions of sovereignty to freshwater aquifers? Some of these treaties, well, there's only a handful, are suggesting this. The draft articles that were sent to the UN General Assembly has a provision suggesting this. Some of us were not very favorable to that provision, but that's what we were just advisors. The legal commission, that's what they drafted. So they're making groundwater more like oil, gas, coal, but not surface water. Surface water is not, you don't see the same notions of sovereignty for surface water. In fact, I don't recall, the only example I can think of off the top of my head where a country has argued sovereignty is Turkey, absolute territorial sovereignty. That's what they argued. China's argued the same thing, absolute territorial sovereignty. They're both upstream, the Mekong and the Tigris and Euphrates. And Egypt sometimes argues absolute territorial integrity. It's an absolute sovereignty argument. The right to receive absolutely the natural flow. That's really the only times I can think of in the last 50, 100 years where sovereignty on surface water has come up to that extent. Groundwater, I don't know. We seem to be at least starting off in that direction. So, any questions on this so far?
I have a point to add. Could there be in these agreements any terms that the different countries would agree on in terms of regular revision for of the terms of the agreement itself? So if there are any percentages or quantities that are agreed on, I mean, this would help capture all of the externalities which and uncertainties that were initially might have not been captured. So something like climate change and the effect of that, something like urbanization in one of the countries and the effect of that on the aquifer. Do these agreements usually have agreed on regular revision periods?
Okay, the good lawyer answer, it depends. Many of these agreements do allow for modifications, for amendments, but very often the process to amend the treaties are very, very challenging, very difficult, because you have to go back to the governments, you have to go back to the legislatures. It's almost as if you're approving a brand new treaty. There are some exceptions, one of which is U.S.-Mexico 1944 treaty over the Rio Grande in Colorado. What they did was they created this commission, the International Boundary Waters Commission, and they empowered that commission to create amendments called minutes. The one you mentioned earlier about the Tijuana water pollution, that's number 320. That means they've had 320 amendments to the treaty since 1944. That's pretty aggressive in terms of amending a treaty. The way that the IBWC achieves these amendments is through a negative process, which is very unique. I've never seen it anywhere else. The two sections, you have a Mexican section and an American section. They hammer out the agreement. Then they send the agreement to their respective governments. And if the respective governments do not negate them within 30 days, they're automatically an amendment. I don't recall, maybe Dr. Kaiser knows, but I don't think that any proposed amendment that the IBWC has ever sent, I may be wrong, but I can't recall any that they've ever sent that has been rejected by one of the federal governments, Mexico or U.S. So that's one way that you can put a provision of amendment. You can create your own mechanism of amendment. The question is, how easily do you want your treaty to be amended? It's up to you. So that's a long way of saying yes to your question. Any other questions? Any other comments?
I also have another question regarding the negotiations. So our team met a couple days ago, and we were wondering how will you run the show next week? Will it be us starting the negotiation with each other? Will you be moderating? Will we need to have our pitch for 5 minutes? And then, I mean, we're wondering what kind of
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
How would it work?
Here's how I plan to do it, and this is a bit of an experiment because we're in different locations and team members are in different locations. So, first of all, when you arrive on the day of negotiation, I'm going to ask you if you have team members at your location, please sit together. Okay, sit within your team. Obviously, some of you won't have team members. You'll be the sole person at that particular location. That's fine. But if you have team members, please sit together. Hopefully, everybody will have a mic or access to a microphone very nearby. And I'm hoping that we can make sure that we have that at all locations. Second of all, you're going to have to use text. You're going to have to use email or some other communication method to talk to your teammates who are at the other locations. You're going to have to decide who speaks first, and maybe you might want to decide who's going to speak on what issue. So you may want in advance to strategize what would happen in this situation. Oh, then you're going to talk about this. But if this happens, then somebody else will talk about something else. Or if issue X comes up, somebody's going to have to address it. Well, who is it? And you can appoint people in your team. How you structure your team in terms of who speaks, who does research, who presents, that's completely up to you. A real negotiating team. In the real world, you have people up front, you have people in the back, you have people running messages. Everybody's important. I leave that up to you to decide who does what job on your team. Yep.
I believe his specific question, because we are in the same
Yeah.
team, is about we have 10 minutes to do what? To
10
just
minutes.
present, because it's 15 minutes, 10 to present and 5 for.
No.
Was it-
That's for your
for our-
presentation. That's for your
We're
presentation.
not presenting.
No. No, that's for your
Remember, we
paper
had a question
presentation.
about how are we going to battle as somebody present their provisions?
No.
So
No,
one-
that's something else. The 10 minutes and 5 minutes, that's for your paper presentations.
Mhm.
Okay? For the negotiation session, I will tell you that CADLand, because they're not hosting anybody, they're going to be speaking first. Okay? Beyond that, I will leave it to anybody else to come in at any point in response to what CADLand begins to raise. Remember, you all have objectives that you've been assigned. So you need to propose rules, arrangements, something for the entire 4-nation community, or to 1 or 2 or some. Remember, we're trying to achieve a treaty here. What provisions were you going to propose? How detailed or how general do you want them? Let me show you 2 quick examples. Let's see. Okay, this agreement that I have right here, this is the DC Al-Sag Aquifer agreement between Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and it's I think I have links on it in the material. You can also find it on my website. If you look, Article 1 is just definitions. Okay, let me skip to Article 2. Article 2 here talks about restricting extraction. That's really all it talks about. Pretty generic, very specific. That's all this treaty really does. Article 3 talks about a joint commission, a committee, to monitor this and exchange information. And that's all they did in this whole agreement. Let me show you a different agreement. This is the Genovese Aquifer Agreement. They must have had some engineers involved here, because I do have a science degree, but I never got to these kinds of formulas. So, do you want this kind of flow regime, allocation, management in this kind of detail in your agreement? These guys did between Switzerland and France. I'm giving you 2 extremes here just so you can think about how detailed or how generic you would want, and on what subject matter. Data sharing, prior notification, exchange of information, specific allocations, research commissions, whatever you can think of. What do you want? What don't you want? What do you know? What don't you know? What do you want to know? What do you want to keep private? These are all the things that you've got to come up with, or at least think about as you develop this agreement.
So
No.
when you say
Yeah.
when you say Cadland will start first, what are we expecting from their statement? Are they gonna basically address each of the countries and where they stand with each, or what? Or is that what we're
They're gonna say
expecting
what
out
they
of the
want.
statements from different countries, and then we'll start the negotiation, or?
You know, I'm going to leave that up to you guys to decide. How much do you want to say up front? How much do you want? This is a negotiation. And in a negotiation, it's not set up in a way that you must say X, Y, Z, or you must present X, Y, Z. Part of this is strategizing, and I'm not grading you on your negotiating skills. I'm much more interested to see what your proposals are and how you use them, and maybe you'll come up with things that are unique and different as a legal regime to manage. You have a surface water body and you have a groundwater body in this particular part of the world. So how much they say, how much Cadland says up front, I'm going to leave up to them. Now, if it starts to get a little slow, I will spur the conversation. I'll start to try to provoke some of you. But I'm hoping that you guys will have enough preparation that you'll start saying, here's what our country wants, here's what our interests are, here's what we're willing to suggest as the first kind of concept rule. Does everybody agree to this rule? Yes, no? Well, how should we change it or modify it? What don't you agree to? What do you agree to? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Anything else? Any other questions? Any other comments?
Is there a way that for the negotiation exercise, the place where we can barely hear them can?
Yeah, I'm hoping that,
Yeah,
College
do something
Station, we
better.
want to make sure that you guys have microphones, as many as possible to the teams. So I've already asked Dr. Kaiser about that. Hopefully that'll be all set up for when we have the negotiation.
And maybe like a brief 5-minute recess in the middle.
I will allow, if the parties want a recess at any point, that's fine. Remember, you'll be hopefully talking to each other on email and whatever other technology you want to use quietly in the background. The one thing that we'll have to monitor is who wants to speak at what point, and we'll just try to be as polite as possible given the technology. And it seems like there's a half-second delay between when somebody speaks and when everybody else hears them on the other side. Anything else? All right. We'll see you all next class.